I just want to elaborate a bit on the ideas that I'm using. So, starting out with idealism and realism, and noting their form of need or goal of universalism, that was a problem. If we're chasing down a nihilist space, then the more suitable ideas are going to be nominalism. From there, I want to introduce conceptualism, and from there, subjectivism. So, just in that regard, why am I going to do that? Because we're going to speak about how concepts are brought together, and that's really quite crucial for any examination of subjectivity. So what is subjectivism in relation to subjectivity? Subjectivism would be a focus on the subject, the human subject. So I'm very aware there's an existential movement that is almost parallel to what Kant did with the subject. So in Kant's idealism, besides chasing down universalism, he's presenting Kantian subjectivity. Now, this emphasis for Kant on the subjective side, and if you like, on the ideal side, as opposed to the empirical side, so as opposed to experience, so what we experience can be distinguished from what we do with our minds and how we proceed to use reason, for example. So a focus on subjectivity results really in an idea of subjectivism. So very close historically to Kant, you've got Kierkegaard's establishment of an existential philosophy. That is a focus on the subject. So it's an interesting occurrence in history that although philosophy to that sort of Enlightenment peak does focus on life, it didn't do so with an explicit subjectivity in mind. They certainly had the subject, the human subject, but the bulk of the approach was what we would call objectivism. So you've got this pair, subject-object. So Kant taking up, in part, I mean, he's an idealist. He's was at pains to point out the way to approach what's known as the rationalist empiricist issue. He made a lot of effort in bringing subjectivity into legitimate conceptual analysis, if I can put it briefly like that. So from that idealism moving through realism, which is a bit more modern, and then nominalism, which is actually has its roots in an older period, going back to a pre-Enlightenment period. But I don't need to get into that. The point about nominalism I spoke about before is that words become a feature of the human environment, but because of the nominalism approach, it's not an event that gives us a reason to think that words are anything special. It's just our form of communication. And there's more than one form of communication, words just being a particularly prominent one. So from subjectivism we have this focus on words, or from nominalism rather, and this concurrent focus on the subject. Between those two things, we really have to put philosophical focus on what's called conceptualism. Conceptualism is a focus on the nuts and bolts of concepts. So what is it that we do, not just when we engage in metaphysics, but what is it we're doing when we use concepts in the way that we do? So when I say I'm free, what is it that I'm saying? Because very cursorily on face, I'm not free, I'm determined according to science. Now, strictly determinism, to grab another ism, it's not something that science investigates. It doesn't really investigate its own presuppositions. So it's kind of we're still on the surface if we're just doing that. So if I say I'm free but acknowledge science, and I'm not just saying that I'm determined in my behaviour when I focus on the scientific side of it, and nor am I saying I'm purely free, because there's no freedom outright. There's lots of different freedoms, of course, depends on where you are, who you are, all sorts of things. Everyone knows that you get more freedom when your means are increased. So if it's money, for example, or other resources, the greater access that you have, then the greater your freedom. So it's great to be part of a country that can be said to be free, of course. But anyway, I don't intend to get too far into the political side of concepts. Freedom, particularly from a Kantian point of view, and this is not particularly idealistic, it is transcendental, so I suppose you can call this a transcendentalism, but we have to continue to create that space. But with Kant, you have this concept of freedom that is strictly tied to reason and is strictly tied to our political institutions. So what we actually do with our political institutions that maintain our freedoms, for example. So strictly that transcendental argument, and this is the form of a transcendental argument, says that reason is the condition of the possibility of freedom, or rather, freedom is the condition of the possibility of reason. So you've got this little bind, but when you get deep into it, freedom is necessary for reason to thrive. I think that's basically it. That's a Kantian point of view. So it's if there was a transcendental object attached or to speak of, this is why conceptualism is important, to speak of, that transcendental element of our subjectivity, if you like, would be freedom. Because freedom's the enabler, just as I mentioned resource and money being an enabler of freedom. There's something also about us that enables freedom. Now, because reason so bound to our political landscape and institutions, we need to match that with a concept that is also so significant, and that's why we say reason together with freedom is going to cover quite a lot of that ground, not just political but also philosophical, because you want these really quite solid roots into whatever ground that you have at the time. Now, I'm speaking metaphorically, but ground and foundation and groundwork and basic ideas or principles, they're very important for conducting the work that needs to be done, even not necessarily political work, but the work that has to have happened for that freedom to be maintained and continued. So maybe more on that there's these transcendental arguments about these concepts that are very important for us in the West, and really the basis of our liberalism can at least be recognised in these sorts of ways, in a transcendental way. Now, I would emphasise this because Kant is so critical in our intellectual history, such that for all his errors, that idea of a transcendental space is really the significant effort, intellectual effort, as I see it, since the time of the ancient Greeks. So, more on that.